Welcome back to UAP Studies podcast. We are joined by Dr. Joshua Pierson today. But before we start, I want to say hello to Katie Page and Dr. Michael Glosson. How are you guys doing?
Well,
Yeah, we're doing great. I think I just got off vacation, so I'm uh
Oh,
I'm happy and sad
sad.
at the
Yeah,
same.
that's the worst part about coming back home is you realize your vacation wasn't as long as you would have liked it to be, and then
Never is.
normal life and stress has to come back, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we come home to plan another vacation. That's what I tell myself.
Yeah, and you almost need a vacation from your vacation. I need at least 2 days off after my vacation just to settle for my vacation. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
I think so.
up on the
Uh,
laundry.
yeah, laundry. That's the worst part is all the laundry from traveling. I know contact in the desert was exactly that. I'm just bringing luggage of dirty laundry back home. That's pretty much what it is after vacation. Dr. Joshua Pearson, I will welcome you to the podcast, my man. How you doing?
I'm doing all right, brother, and thanks for having me on. Thank you for having me on. I always enjoy getting to talk with you, Katie and Mike. It's always a good time.
Absolutely, dude.
And I've been looking forward to this one, to getting on and going through this with y'all, and seeing what type of feedback we get. That'll definitely be interesting.
Yeah.
This is
And
such a
we
unique sort of thing that we're doing today with you. I mean, we did it sort of with Thomas Jane, but
Mhm.
it's not our normal format. So I think it's nice to be able to give the audience a different taste of presentation of ideas.
Yeah, and actually, we should mention Joshua did do his presentation, but we messed up because we weren't used to these presentations. We got him a little bit confused because we kept asking questions halfway through, and then we're like, no, let's redo it because it needs to be about the presentation. And then Joshua had a medical situation, and then it threw us off to putting them back. And we actually the first episode should have aired I think like a month and a half ago at
A month
least,
ago.
but we wanted to redo it and do it justice because I think I wasn't thinking at the time. I was like, oh, let's just throw some questions halfway through. That was not the way to do it. So we learned from Thomas Jane, and we promised this time, Joshua, we're not going to intervene. But before we start, I'd like the audience to know a little bit more about you, who you are, and how you got to this point of doing your dissertation. Dissertation is what you call it, right?
Yeah, well, I've actually got a slide on that, so
Well, bring it on. Let's do
we can
it.
pop straight to that
I
one.
need to do notes this time too, so I'm better prepared second time around. I have my pen, my paper ready. I'm gonna take some
Awesome.
notes.
All the questions. So what we're going to do is it's kind of a long presentation. I'm going to run through about 40 minutes. And then at that 40 minutes, I'm going to stop, open up where we are for questions at that point. And then, next session will come on and go for the next round and just go until we finish this.
Love it. Well, let's go ahead. We'll give you the mic.
This is what we're going to cover. This is essentially what was presented at as the methodology, or excuse me, this is what was presented as the agenda for the dissertation defense, and also what I presented at the All Domain Aerospace Phenomena Conference with the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. All right, so this is who I am, right? And I'm relatively new to the UAP community. I got involved in the topic in around 2017 and 2018. And it wasn't because of the article that was published. It was because a friend of mine sat me down and was like, let's have a thoughtful conversation about your dissertation topic. And then he gave me that article and I reviewed it. And that was really the impetus for getting into it. So who am I? I'm an active duty soldier. I'm a Chief Warrant Officer 4. That means that within the grand scheme of, to put it into corporate parlance, I'm more or less an advisor, a technical advisor on a very specific profession and craft. I'm a counterintelligence agent, and I know that can really kind of make some people a little uncomfortable. But what is unique about the UAP problem is there tends to be a lot of counterintelligence surrounding it. And the reason why is in CI, we tend to, like, our job is to prove intangibles and to prove negatives. And so when you have something like unidentified anomalous phenomena, you're essentially proving an abstraction, right? Like those are three ways to say, I don't know what it is. So from that standpoint, that's why there tends to be a lot of CI guys kind of surrounding the issue that we know that have come out to talk about this topic. I've got 24 years in the Army, spent some time in Afghanistan and Iraq, I've also spent some time in the Philippines, Thailand, Japan, Guam, Korea, and this is all doing the CI mission. And so, essentially at the base level or at the foundational level, what is a CI mission? It's detecting foreign adversary attempts to gather national defense related or highly sensitive information from our, from our allies and other U.S. government, U.S. military, domains, areas, locations. As a soldier, my focus is on the U.S. Army and foreign entity efforts to try and penetrate U.S. Army equities. I'm currently stationed at Fort Liberty. I put Fort Bragg in there because, as we all know, we recently went through a name change, and I tend to forget these new names and have to, lean on my staff to ask, like, hey, where is this? Because, they change them all. I've got 24, 25 years in. You can say I'm institutionalized. So if I get the names wrong, it's not because of any sort of, it's only because, like, oh yeah, once again, I've forgotten because I'm used to what it was called before, right? So again, looking at what does CI do, we look at national security crimes, right? And sedition, treason, espionage, subversion. There's a lot of books written about these things, but that tends to be our focus. We answer intelligence information requirements. So, our job is to inform policymakers of the threat to their equity, and a lot of times, or most often than not, how we figure out what they're interested in is by the information requirements. Basically, what are they asking for? At the end of the day, we're essentially professional gossips. Again, proving a negative, finding the intangible, means you end up talking to a lot of people and trying to discern behavioral characteristics of whatever is the target of, that conversation. And so you end up looking like a gossip from time to time, right? I recently came out of a battle with cancer, highly successful. It's currently at no disease progression. It was had a really big tumor in my nasal cavity, but all in all, it's working out well. I managed to finish the dissertation, the doctoral dissertation, while going through treatment. So there's some pictures up here. You'll see me in the hospital. That's when I was, either receiving an infusion, prepping for an infusion, or coming out of an infusion, where I'm, cataloging these cases, and and then afterwards, when treatment was done, one of my kids would sit next to me as I'm going through the case files to pull out the signature data, and I'd fall asleep, and they would just poke me like, "Dad, you got to be awake a little longer before it's your break time." So it was big help in keeping me focused on the task. I'm also a husband and a father. I'm married to Katie Beth. We've been married 19 years now, and I have an 18-year-old daughter named Jaden and a 14-year-old named Christina. And I can truly say that I would not be doing this if it wasn't for the support that Katie Beth has given me to continue moving on and well, not only in my career, in life in general, but even on a topic like this. It can get a little disheartening because there's recently we've seen a lot more support come out for stuff like this. When I was going through it, it was essentially like one-off. You had the giants that came before you that you could lean on, and then you had yourself. And that's pretty much kind of what you were working with. Luckily for me, is I had some key relationships that were extremely helpful for me to lean on to keep moving forward with this project. These are my academic credentials. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Intelligence Studies from American Military University, a Master's of Science in Strategic Security and Protection Management, and I have a professional degree, a doctorate in Strategic Security from National American University. This dissertation presentation that y'all are receiving is the end result of that dissertation. Both this presentation and the dissertation are available online at a Zenodo link that we can drop in the in the bar at the end. Before moving forward, I do need to read a disclaimer. So if I could have a second to pull that up. Give me just a sec, all right? I'm going to pause and come back, and if you guys could
No
splice
worries.
this part
Yeah,
in.
no worries. We could fill the time in between.
Okay.
This is what we do. You know what I mean? It's what we do. We're fill-ins.
Yeah, we're fillers.
Yeah, I guess you would have to have some disclaimer. Being an active duty officer, they would make sure that you have a disclaimer, because this is sort of like your own project, not associated to the military per se.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
thank you for your service too, by the way.
Yeah, 100%.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm
And
Canadian,
I'll
but
say
I still
this.
thank you. Yeah.
I'll say this, and I don't mean this as a tongue-in-cheek. Thank you for paying your taxes. If you opted to not pay it, we wouldn't be here. And that is a key point that my wife pokes me when I say that. I'm like, it's true. If people are like, I'm not paying taxes, I mean, I think it's important. All right, so I'm going to read this disclaimer, and if we would just splice it over like that particular slide, is that possible?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. All right. So before we move on, I'm going to read a disclaimer. And again, it's important because I'm still on active duty that I put this out. The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are mine and do not reflect the views or opinions of the Department of the Army, the Department of Defense, or the United States intelligence community.
Noted.
We will not hold you accountable with the Army on this. You are separate, and we acknowledge it.
Sure, the Army will. Well, I won't cut that part out too. Okay. Moving on to the next slide. Okay, so the impetus for the dissertation, right? Well, let me go back to this real quick. So again, at the very bottom, I didn't complete this slide. Man, I'm like way off. Sorry. I'm also the National Security Advisor for the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies and for the Society for UAP Studies. The Society for UAP Studies is putting on their annual conference in the middle of August, from 16 to 18 August. They're putting on the varieties and trajectories of contemporary UAP studies, where their goal is to bring together academics and professionals from across the various interdisciplinary fields to essentially discuss how we think about UAP and how we study UAP. So using more academic language, which they know better than I do, and I'm sure they'll correct me on it, which no problem there. They're looking at the epistemology and the philosophy of what is UAP. So if you're able, I would recommend going to that conference. It's on an online platform. Go to the societyforuapstudies.com or Society for UAP Studies webpage, and it's the forward-facing page. Will walk you through how to sign up for the conference. With the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, we're still working through that intention study project. I know that's kind of become a hot topic, and I think one of the things we need to remember off of that as we're wrapping up paper 4 is that the data sets being used are curated off of a standard, right? So if some reports or some year group doesn't make it in there, it doesn't mean that the report has gaps. It means that what they were looking for, that data set doesn't meet the threshold of curated data. And you're going to see how I did that in the intention study, did the same thing through their methodological process. We're wrapping up paper 4. Afterwards, we're going to publish the estimate of the situation for paper 5, but it's going to be essentially our grandfather's estimate of the situation because it's from 1947 to 75. If we do the study again, then we're going to get the estimate of the situation for our time, for where we are in space and time. Lastly, with the SCU, I think this is important. Robert Powell, our executive director, is going to be presenting at the AIAA conference, where he's going to be talking about the study that he led on the characteristics of shapes. Now, what's interesting about this particular presentation that he's giving is when I heard him talk about it at the SCU conference. Afterwards, he and I had a conversation. We essentially did 2 independent studies that have validated each other. Neither one of us used the same methodology. We didn't use the same data collection process. I ended up with 684 cases. He ended up with 301. And as we were talking to each other, and after I looked at his slides and he looked at mine, and the aha moment came on, and we said, we might be able to do a comparative analysis of both of these studies to see what the end results, what that would look like as the end results. He and I still owe him an idea generation session, but it's interesting that now we have 2 separate studies done independently, And I essentially had no idea about the characteristic study that he did. And then when I saw his findings, I was like, you know, because he took it from a material science standpoint, I took it from a phenomenological standpoint, and they seem to, and they, you know, on its face, they validated each other. So that's key when we start talking about, you know, the role of good science and the usefulness of good science. It would also have been key if they didn't validate each other, because that would mean we need to go back and relook at the data sets and see if there are commonalities. All right, so the impetus for the dissertation, right? So I started out in social movement theory, and you know, social movement theory is interesting. You know, it's all about collective human behavior, and studying collective human behavior in and of itself is you know, a dynamic topic that can go almost anywhere. But the field is saturated with you know, dissertations, theses, thought papers, you know, proposals, articles on social movement theory. And so and my approach was essentially to treat social movements like a international relations problem. And as I'm sitting down talking about this with a friend of mine, as I said, you know, I'm interested in it, but I think what's going to happen when I write this is it's going to go nowhere. I'm just going to check a block that I did a dissertation, and then it's going to get, you know, filed into history, and then that's going to be the end of it. You know, so I'm going to lose interest going through it because, you know, I'm all about doing repetitions for the sake of repetitions, but you know, I would like something on the back end that maybe has some meat and may affect somewhere. And so I was, you know, talking to, you know, Dr. Joe Denoto about this, and who's also a doctor in strategic security, and was like, you know, I'm not really seeing the point in continuing on with social movements. And he said, well, have you thought about unidentified aerial phenomena? Because at the time, that's what it was. It was like, wait, you mean like UFOs? Like, you know, I mean, I watched Close Encounter of the Third Kind once. Like you know, I'm not seeing, like, how is this a national security problem? And I said, so, you know, I'm going to need some help defining what is the problem here. And over a bottle or two of some bourbon and a couple documentaries, and him handing me the Nimitz report, you know, I said, okay, well, you know, that there looks like there may be a problem. You know, you can't explain what happened with the Nimitz encounter, but again, that could be, I mean, at the time, this is a thought process, that could be an anecdote, just one time where this highly anomalous event occurred. Does that, you know, connote a national security problem, which is the focus of your dissertation in a doctorate of strategic security program, is you're writing to discuss a strategic security or national security problem. And so I said, okay, I'm still like, that's interesting. It's very interesting. You know, we have, and then one of the documentaries he showed me was anecdotal evidence of anomalous activity affecting the general public. I was like, okay, it's interesting, but I'm not seeing the tie on how this is something that we should all be concerned about. And he said, well, let me introduce you to some people. And then he introduced me to Mr. Rich Hoffman, who, you know, to his credit, was open to me asking some rather pointed questions about the UFO topic and whether or not this was legit. And, you know, I asked him to tell me a story, asked him to walk me through his experiences with researching the topic. And, you know, he did an excellent job defining where or how this looks like, you know, how this should be something that is of interest to the U.S. national security apparatus or national security community. Excuse me. And then I sat down with Larry Hoffman's book, also given to me by Joe, and Unidentified: The National Intelligence Problem of UFOs was integral to defining, is it our problem? And Larry's book takes the problem from the 1940s all the way through to, I believe, around 2012, I think, is his cutoff. It's been a minute since I've sat with the book. And it was the first UFO book that I read. was Larry Hancock's book. And I was looking for, is it our problem? Okay, so we have a problem. They're like anecdotes, like, is it ours? That answered that question. Yes, it is our problem. Then how much of a problem is it? One of the key things or key elements that I remember from Larry's book is that as he's going through and providing his case studies, it's essentially an overarching theme of, hey, look, this is a national security issue. We need to look at it like that. So they picked up Leslie Kean's book, where you got to the brass tacks of the case studies and highly detailed on what the effect that these were having on both the national security community, but artifacts of the national security, locations of national security, and even just regular commercial airline pilots, that there's anomalous activity occurring that can have disastrous effects on those who fly planes. So then now we've decided, I learned that, okay, it's a big problem, but is it one that's existed over time? Have some anecdotes. We have a nice theme coming out of Larry's book. We have these detailed accounts coming out of Leslie's book. But is this something that's existed over time and isn't just compartmentalized to specific areas or artifacts? And I picked up Michael Swords and Robert Powell's book, UFOs and Government, A Historical Inquiry. I've read that book twice from cover to cover. That thing, I think, is 1,000 pages. It is a tome. It's an encyclopedia of the UFO problem and government's role in it. And if there's any interest in understanding government's role in the UFO problem, pick up Michael Swords and Robert Powell's book. It also demonstrated that not only has a problem existed over time, it's a pervasive issue. It's everywhere. Where there's UFO reporting, it's a problem there. What is interesting out of that book, and what I gleaned as one of my findings, one of my personal findings, not a key finding in the dissertation, is that this problem is so pervasive that where we see gaps in geographical locations is most likely due to there not being a solid reporting apparatus to determine how much of a problem it is in those locations too. So then, to make sure I wasn't going crazy, because that's also important when you also have to make sure you're checking your biases as you're going through, because the more that you're related to stuff like this and you're influenced by what you're taking in, you need to have somebody on the outside who is not affiliated with the project at all. And I asked Katie Beth to have no interest in this until we got through me determining whether or not there was an issue, so she could be the unbiased third party. And so I sat down with her and I said, I'm going to give you a presentation and I want you to let me know what you think. And at the end of it, she goes, it looks like you have a problem. And then that's what led to framing the problem statement. On the right on this particular slide is a certificate of dissertation approval. The title's wrong. At the end of it all, it's one of those things that we just couldn't get fixed in the time needed to get the signatures on so we could get it to publishing and get the certificate and do all the things that come with closing out an academic degree plan. But I do want to make special note for Dr. Kemp, Dr. Davis, Dr. Nyman, and Dr. Burke. They took a chance with this particular topic. This is still a controversial topic that has a stigma surrounding it. I started this dissertation in 2020. Right. So to put some time frame, some time into that, in 2020, this was still a highly stigmatized issue. And yet their key point was, if you can frame out the problem statement and you can use quantitative and qualitative approaches to study it, we'll approve it. And so so if it wasn't for them taking a chance and assuming a little bit of risk, on behalf of the academic institution, this wouldn't have happened. All right, so what is the problem? Simply put, UAP penetrates sovereign airspace and sea space. That is one of the essential elements that emerged as I went through basic research. whatever this is, and we like to associate UAP with an object or some sort of material aspect. I'm not even sure we're there yet. And to make a plug for that real quick, we started with unidentified flying objects in the 40s. And then as as research went on and we got through the stigma decades, I won't even say years, stigma decades, we came to unidentified aerial phenomena, and then unidentified aerospace phenomena, and now unidentified anomalous phenomena. So whatever it is, we've regressed in our definition. Now, some in the community at times appear to have an issue with that regression. To me, that looks like good science. We're finally defining it as for what we know it is, right? And so when I say UAP in this, it is a host of various phenomena or anomalies that have penetrated sovereign airspace and sea space and have been detected. They've been observed or they've been picked up on radar, and at times both, right? That's unique because now we can place that penetration in space and time. Science and government communities lack cohesion. I wouldn't say they work at cross purposes. I would say that there really isn't any meat for them to, there isn't any incentive for them to work together. And a lot of that, we could speculate, a lot of that is due to government activity from the 40s to the 60s with the Condon Report, and then coming out of the Condon Report, when it was deemed not a threat and useless to science, it just seemed to continue to create it created a stigma that didn't allow for some sort of effort to look at this problem. Now, that isn't stating that government and science and scientific communities should be working together. They should be working independently and finding those areas of mutual benefit to come together to talk about the topic. That is key. And when we talk about the lack of cohesion, that's essentially what was lacking, is that one entity felt that they had primacy on researching the topic, the government, and anytime academics went to try and research it, there was a stigma attached to their research. And so it didn't help the approach at all, and has created an environment to where people are institutions are circumspect of agendas, as opposed to just trying to get to the good science to talk about the problem. UAP is phenomenological. We experience it, right? Observations, we move from, observations to those who state that they have experiences and contacts to those who have stated they were abducted, right? And so this is rich for structured analytic techniques. This dissertation specifically focuses on attempting to define some of the material aspects or some of the signatures that would be tied to the more material aspects of UAP. And we'll get to the reasons behind that when we get to the exclusionary criteria. But there is a wide parameter for what a phenomenological encounter with UAP is. Not necessarily sure it's been fully defined. There's some of our anthropologists, and I think some of our bioethics, I hope I got that right, bioethics academics are working on defining what a phenomenological encounter as it relates to UAP is. So is it a threat, right? Moving on to the next part. It's commonly discussed. I mean, even now, it's a more discussed topic of UAP and threat. And that seems to be the primary talking point. Is it a threat? Is it a threat? Well, there's only really 2 to 3 entities in the US government that look at, is it a threat? And that seems to be the primary means of conversation, is determining threat. The talk on the science side, which should be more, there should be more focus on that than on attempting to determine whether or not UAP pose a threat, even though that is what propelled UAP into the common thought is trying to determine what is a threat and does UAP pose that threat. It isn't the only question we should be asking, right? But that's like that is one of the premier topics when working through the UAP problem. Governments, their job essentially is to determine if there is a threat, right? And that's not only with UAP, that's with a myriad of other, areas as well. That's where you start getting into, national security communities. Some people like to say national security states, and you start getting into how governments relate with other governments. It's with the UAP piece, you have, governments attempting to determine if UAP poses a threat. And one of the issues that has arisen is that the data sets do not equate to what the findings are. And a good example of that is the Condon report. My dissertation, the impetus for this, another impetus for this dissertation was after reading the Condon report and seeing the incongruencies between what Dr. Condon wrote in his introduction and his conclusion with what was actually written in the report. Said, okay, this is not only is this not good science, right? But this is not, like, these findings do not equate to what the cadre of experts he had looking at it stated as well. And then there's also some other issues surrounding that report that as an intel professional and a strategic security doctor that were cause for concern. And so that was also one of the driving factors, was like, okay, well, this is what is essentially the unofficial official U.S. government position, is the Condon report. I'm going to take a look at it and see how accurate it is, and do a study and publish it. And that's what this dissertation is. So also, when we talk about threat, we have to understand what is threat. In national security or strategic security definition, is threat requires two things: capability and intent. Capability is the means to impose a will upon another. The intent is the desire to impose that will. Action is outside of the parentheses, because when an action occurs to impose a will, that now becomes a point for us to better define what, whether or not it poses a threat, right? And so, looking at the UAP problem, there's essentially 5 terms that I've noticed, or that I've induced after researching it, that tend to pop up. You have Dr. Jacques Vallée stating that it's physical and psychic in nature. He also states it's absurd, right? So there's really 6. So he also states it's absurd. Now, when there's an interaction or an encounter with a UAP, tends to be 3 means by which it's described: benevolent, malevolent, or ambivalent, right? It's either good, bad, or it doesn't care, right? So now, when we look at trying to define intent, one of the issues we run into is that we have to approach it from an anthropomorphic standpoint, from how we look at the problem, how we define a rational actor. So we don't know what is leading to this encounter. We don't know how it led to this encounter, and we don't even know whether or not it is intelligently controlled or isn't of itself intelligent. We don't know that. We have many hypotheses. We have some theories surrounding that. Where there's discussion now about non-human intelligence, but we're still working towards, what is not only what is a UAP, but what may or may not be controlling it. Excuse me. When you have no sinuses, makes things like this a lot of fun. Feel free to leave that in there with my washcloth on my face. I'm sure they'll love that.
You know what? We try not to edit any of the interviews, because it keeps it more raw and real, and people love it. If somebody's sincere and like yourself, you're lovable. So I wouldn't even worry about it, brother.
Gotta wipe my face down there. All right, so I left off with NHIs. I said, okay, so even with all the conversation surrounding NHI, we have to remember that as the highest form of discovered life on planet Earth, right? We're still approaching whatever this problem may be through our lens, right? Through how we've experienced the world. So defining threat is going to require more than just one person writing a dissertation, right? So I focus most of my effort on attempting to determine capability. And we'll get into that in future slides. So how I had to phrase this with regard to threat is now I looked at it not necessarily as does UAP, pose a threat to national security, but what is the risk proposition of UAP and its interactions with the national security community and with general populations? Does it pose a risk to the national security community and to the general public? Right. That was the approach that I took when framing this out, because I couldn't work through intent as one individual trying to apply rational choice theory to something described as physical, psychic, and absurd. Right. And even when we remove Dr. Vallet's standpoint and you look at the cases, it still looks physical, psychic, and absurd. Right. And that's critical to understanding how structured analytic techniques would work when we move forward, and also when developing key assumptions. So what did I do essentially, right? So I use structured analytic techniques, and this is a phrase that I'm more than likely going to say, quite a bit throughout this dissertation. A structured analytic technique is the U.S. intelligence community industry standard for conducting analytical methodologies to determine both threat and risk and informing a policymaker on what it is the adversary may be doing next, is essentially the gist of a structured analytic technique. There's 68 of them. When I started in 2000, there were 12 to 14, and now we're up to 68. The purpose of a structured analytic technique is to have a process. It's a scientific process that gives you the means of working with inaccurate, incomplete, and deceptive information. And anyone who's ever taken a UFO report knows that at least two of those are present: inaccurate and incomplete, right? And so we're always going back and trying to gather more data from the source, to the point that at times the source feels like they're browbeat into trying to give everything they can until they just go, I don't know. But they're the only source of that information, and that's the only interactor or individual observer of that encounter. So what a structured analytic technique does is it gives you tools for how to take that report and categorize it into a usable formula, so that way you can come out with some sort of analysis on the end. The beauty of it is that since it's a technique, you can remove said report if come to find out it's either way too inaccurate or it's deceptive, right? But what it does is, using structured analytic techniques, I was able to go through, and after developing my curation standard, was able to go through the databases and pull out those reports that met that standard. All right, so this is the what, right? And I'm gonna run through this slide relatively quickly. I've spent quite a bit on the previous ones, and this is a lot of academic jargon, essentially on the process of building a dissertation, right? So you have to define we define my problem statement. Now we define the purpose. The purpose is essentially, what am I going to do and how am I going to do it, right? So I'm going to look into UAP data sets. I'm going to survey them and find those reports where there may be where we can start determining patterns based off of observable and detectable signatures, right? And the definition of signature is in the dissertation. So I would recommend going to the dissertation in my terms of reference and taking a look at that to pull that out. And then I based it on curated case studies, right? I curated those case studies, right? Or I'm sorry, I based it on curated case studies, meaning that I had to look to other people who did the work and were able to determine credibility and rationality and reliability of the source to ensure that that particular case or that particular case study was worthy of further scrutiny, right? And so that's where I came up with the 16 references. I didn't interview anyone. And the reason why I didn't came down to two things, right? I would have needed an institutional review board standard, and getting the IRB, I probably would not have met the deadline for having the dissertation submitted in time. I was already buttressing up against it, having to go through the medical treatment with, with the cancer treatment that I had to go through. And the second reason was that we already have a lot of information out there on the topic. Finding new data doesn't necessarily, I mean, at this point, it wouldn't have done much for me, because people have tried to take a thoughtful look at these data sets. And yet we hadn't necessarily gotten to a point to where we had a study that culminated on what it was that we might be saying when we say UAP or encounter. There's a myriad of books trying to work through that process. And we can go through the thousands of reasons why it didn't come to fruition. I mean, personally, I think a lot of it is a stigma that was attached to it on trying to pare down to using these types of data sets. And so my focus was, why don't we look at these old data sets from these authors and these other databases that have captured all of this, and see what we can derive from that first before we start trying to collect new information, right? And then I built my curation standard off of that. This was my research question. It's a mouthful. The basis of it is, what is available out there that could possibly, that provides information on signatures of UAP that exist over time and space in a pattern that are detectable, meaning that, is there a way that, either now or in the future, these types of detections could be replicated, right? And where you get into phenomenological issues, it can't be replicated in a lab. But if you have an object that's detected through a FLIR, right? Could a FLIR detect, another object with similar characteristics in the future, right? And that's is essentially the basis of the question. I couldn't answer sub-question 1. There's not a lot of information out there with environment and UAP. There's a lot of anecdotal discussion about it. For example, some reports a UAP occurs, it's a nice day out, sunny, low humidity, you want to be outside. UAP presents itself, manifests at somebody, and then it, dematerializes, and it starts to rain, gets really cold, right? There's anecdotal reports of that. In the data sets I surveyed, there's not a lot of information to work with it. So I couldn't answer question 1. Question 2, I could answer, and I would say that one was answered rather successfully. Moving on to the objectives, these are my measures of performance. It's important to establish those, and this is essentially the crux of, other than the curation standard, this is the crux of why this dissertation was so successful, is that I built out measures of performance so that way I could go back through and make sure that I hit each mark in these five key performance objectives before I move forward into my measures of effectiveness, which would be your analysis, findings, and conclusions, right? So when I was halfway through the 20,000 case data sets that I was looking at and realized that I needed to change my curation rule, I was able to look at my performance objectives, my curation rule, go back to report 1 and do it again, right? So, when I say 20,000, that's not hyperbolic. New Fork has 121,000 cases in their database. Well, I'm sorry, testimonies to observation in their database, right? So we don't know what's in that database. We just know that there's 121,000 of it, right? So it's not hyperbolic to say, yeah, no, I scrolled through 20,000 cases. Also understanding that the majority of the time a case within a UAP report or testimony is typically a pithy 3 to 5 line statement. So you can scroll through pretty quickly when you develop a curation standard to determine what needs to stay and what doesn't. This is the current process for documentation. Again, this is my assessment of what the current process is. There's nothing published on how it's currently done. We have a lot of UAP databases. We have a lot of people trying to build curation models. We're getting better, which is excellent that we're now seeing more scrutiny applied to databases about what they bring in, and I know that that's only going to be a trend that continues, but this is how it's been for a long time. The event occurs, the witness testifies to it, puts it in a repository, and then there's no scrutiny. Now, I think a lot of the reason for this is that we had so much time having to work through a stigma that we were convincing, that the population was just convincing others that, hey, look, this isn't something to be ignored. It's not always little green men or UFOs hijacking cows or abducting cows or whatever, right? Like all these wild stories surrounding the topic that more than likely didn't originate from those who've encountered a UAP, right? So it's just noise surrounding the topic. And so you have databases with reports or testimonies upon testimonies because there's no other means to try and convince that there's no need for a stigma. Like it's real. People are experiencing it, and it's important to focus on that. So what I did is this is how I approached the data sets, right? Examine, and it looks like, I'm still working through this slide because it was both concurrent and a forward trajectory. So, the examination of testimonies, the curation standard, and identifying the most credible sources with reliable information, those three tended to happen at the same time. But the reason why it's listed out in a forward trajectory is that as I'm going through these testimonies and identifying those sources and applying it to the curation standard, I'm having to change my curation rules and then go back to step one, which is examine the testimonies, right? But it's still a forward trajectory going through. And it's important because I know some people are going to hang on that, well, he changes his rules. That's how it is. That's the purpose of a structured analytic technique. What's important is not whether you change your rule. It's what you do afterwards. Are you doing the diligence to go back to report one and read them all the way through again? Or are you just changing the rule and moving forward? And what I was doing is, and I would be 5,000 cases in, have to change the rule, go back, and then, read them through. And so as we look through this trajectory, this is essentially where we're going, is that after you get through your curation standard and you reviewed the testimonies, now you're applying it through the structured analytic techniques for an analytical methodology. You do the same. You also have a structured analytic techniques for your data collection. It's two separate methods. Okay, so now getting through the methodology, there it is. 20,000 cases surveyed from 1942 to 2021. I think that's essentially the buzz number is around 20,000 is what it was from that set. I'll tell you, I didn't use the New Fork database because there's no scrutiny applied to it. It was very hard hard isn't even the right, there is no means to determine veracity, authenticity of the report, or reliability or credibility of the source. And that proves some difficulty. That's why I looked to something like UFO Casebook, because when I pulled reports out of UFO Casebook, their military reports, they took directly from FOIA information on UAP events that occurred with military artifacts, personnel, or locations. Furthermore, they had the news article for those cases occurring with the general public. Extremely important, because I can use that as a form of determining credibility of the report. At that point, we're talking about the credibility of the journal that published it, as opposed to, the veracity of the report, which is a different conversation. And again, you're working with inaccurate, incomplete, and at times deceptive information. So you can assume some risk with an article coming from a newspaper or a journal, more so than you can from a database where you can't determine one way or the other where or how the report originated. So After going through those 20,000 testimonies, they were pared down to 2,368 reports. And how we got to report is it met the initial phase of curation standard, meaning that it had a date, a time, a location, at least 2 sources were present, and it had at least 3 signatures. If I could determine that, I went back and reviewed it again to further pare it down, right? And then, or no, I'm sorry, it was date, time, location, and at least 2 sources. Had to have at least 2 sources, and sources were defined as it could be 2 individuals, it could be an individual and an object, individual trace signature, an individual and some pets, right? All other, we can't interview an animal, but it gives us a means of determining, of placing the report within space and time. And when I say an individual and an object, we have reports of UAP manifesting and then cars stopping, or one of them, a pilot encountered a UAP, radar didn't pick it up. When he landed, there was a green residue on his wing, right? So that residue becomes a source, right? So, and so after I got through, at least 2 sources, I went through and looked at these, the cases, these 2,368 cases again, and 1,684 were excluded because they didn't have at least 3 signatures, right? So that left 684 cases that met curation standards. I'm at 40 minutes. I would like to go to slide 14, which is exclusionary criteria, and then we'll stop there. Okay, so curation review, very simple, yes or no, put it in a code book, which a code book was essentially a field note journal. 12 of these were filled out, 12 to 14 were filled out with the cases that were put in them. And added to the data set. So it was all analog. I didn't have AI or a large language model or anything like that. It was just straight up pen, paper, and the database. And then what that informed was the data matrix. So it's running 2 separate matrices. One was the reference matrix. One was the data matrix, right? The data matrix is the one that had the cases. And what it informed, what it did is it provided an informed analysis, which ended up in profile statements, some graphs and pie charts to further place UAP in space and time and understand some of the relationships. I also put them on a map and where we're able to work, maybe some cluster areas based on date, time, location, and based on date, time, and location. All right, this is just a graphic representation of what we just talked about. Nice little flow chart. I'm not going to walk us through. I'll just pause for a second for y'all to take a look. Really, it's just the process by which I set the rules and the standards. Okay, these are the references I surveyed. I went through 16 references, and again, I'm relying on author credibility when they did their work. But again, because I can't solely rely on author credibility when I applied a curation standard. So David Marler, excellent work. Triangular UFOs, an estimate of the situation. I wish I could have used every single one of those reports because on its face, all those reports looked highly credible. But to ensure that I had a solid data set, 166 were excluded for various reasons. The 64 that were included had date, time, location, 2 sources, 3 signatures, and all derived from a primary source, right? So that is a curation standard that I used, and so that way it removes the arbitrary nature of, well, why not this report? Why not that report? When somebody comes behind me, if they want to replicate what I did and all the way through with the same curation standard, we should have roughly the same numbers of cases included and excluded. And I say roughly because, again, they may interpret something a little different than I did when it came to exclusion or exclusion. Oh, I walked us through David Marler, but Jerome Clark was my example for the presentation. So we can just cut this slide out if y'all want. Okay, exclusionary criteria. right? This is why they were excluded. 663 were single source. 429 had less than 3 signatures. So as you're seeing, you can see how the exclusionary criteria fed into what the final data set was, right? The CE3 encounter one is interesting, right? It's extremely interesting. Those 75 cases met every single rule of the curation standard with the exception of CE3. And I'm going to quickly define the CE protocol. Close Encounter 1 protocol is observation of UAP. Close Encounter 2 protocol is some sort of physiological trace was left. Close Encounter 3 protocol is some sort of biological encounter is reported. This is based off of Dr. J. Allen Hynek's definitions. I think we're now up to Close Encounter 5, or I think Close Encounter 4 is abduction, and then Close Encounter 5 is some sort of contactee protocol. Like, I mean, you know, so that's what, I don't know if those are the generally accepted ones. With 4 and 5, I know that, and I know that through the research that or the basic research going through the topic. But with this dissertation, you know, Close Encounter 1, 2, and 3 protocol based off of what Dr. J. Allen Hynek defined is what I used. Those 75 cases would have been included if I didn't eliminate based off of biological encounters. And I eliminated based off of biological encounters primarily because for 2 reasons. One, it's rather abstract and requires more scrutiny and understanding to define what is a biological encounter. And this dissertation just was not situated with enough time to do that. And 2, academia isn't necessarily ready. And when I say academia, I mean the institution of academia, of academics, isn't necessarily ready to have a discussion of biological relationships with UAP, right? So one of my follow-on projects is I'm going to go back and look at these 75 cases, and I'm going to see what the relationships are with the UAP in and of itself and with the reported objects that are created in the profile groups that we'll see at the, you know, during the next part. With that being said, I'm going to stop there and open up for questions because that puts us at 46 minutes.
Wow, I can't wait to see the data that comes along with this. I mean, it is very meticulous the way that you went through this, and obviously no easy task. So I'm blown away. You're far more smarter than I am. I would have not come up with that, which is awesome. But at the same time, I think I'm more mad at Sean Kirkpatrick now than I was before, because why wasn't this part of, you know what I mean? Like, why is this on UAP Studies podcast and not on a government funded program to discover UAPs and investigate it? I mean, you just made them look like morons based on the research that they've done. I don't know what the hell they're doing, but wow, that's cool. So let's open up the questions. We'll start with Michael, Katie next, and then I'll go after.
Okay, so thank you for going through that so meticulously for us. It's the sort of thing that my nerdy academic brain feasts on. But it takes a lot of chewing, and so I want to see if you'll help me chew through some of the parts that I have. I mean, I have a long list of questions here. So what's the best one of these to start with? Okay, so one thing that I wondered about is you say that there's this kind of assumption when it comes to the question of like not intentions, but the like threat narrative, or the question of a threat narrative, is you say that there's this assumption that whatever's behind UAP is either benevolent, malevolent, or ambivalent. And that seemed to me like it excludes a possibility. And I wanted to see how you think. I'm not saying that you are necessarily advocating that sort of like 3 option axis or whatever, but I want to see how you think that people who want to apply that would parse this one case. So imagine we come upon a sort of non-human intelligence whose interests are just so wildly different from ours that sometimes what they want to do is perfectly fine. They want to like fix global warming or something for the planet because they want to live here. but they also want to like start growing all these new plants here that are gonna eat, the butterflies or something. And they also want to like eradicate everybody who's living in Indonesia because they want to use that for farming or something. It's like some of it's great, some of it's has nothing to do with us necessarily, some of it is awful. That doesn't seem like it's either benevolent, malevolent, or ambivalent. It seems like the concept I would want to use is orthogonal, which is the concept that is used in mathematics sometimes, where it just like cuts from a completely different angle. It's neither like straight on or it just has nothing to do with us almost. Does that make sense? How do you think such people would parse that?
We have to look at precedent, right? And what we have that essentially explains, well, let me go back and put it like this. What you've described is some sort of outside entity imposing its will on another and violating the tenets of sovereignty. That's a threat, right?
Mhm.
Like, so I hesitate to use colonization quips, but it's what we have essentially to understand what that looks like. And just because you show up and claim benevolence, that doesn't mean that it's all good, and so I don't even know if I would classify that as, I don't know. When it comes to like using a term like orthogonal, like it just cuts through, that's a threat, is how it still kind of fits within the realm of, one of the three. But like the second you get to, I'm going to do X, irrespective of, how you feel about it, because Y is the result, right? That's already a threat in and of itself because it's violating sovereignty,
Sure.
right? So
Okay.
you
So
want
threat
to,
doesn't necessarily mean like physical harm necessarily, or like any particular bad outcome. It might threaten something abstract and immaterial, like our concept of sovereignty or independence or whatever it may be that we value.
and that, yes, and that's an important, it's important to understand, right? Is it posing, is the phenomena posing a threat because it moved really fast next to a fighter jet?
Mhm.
That's a definite risk. Is it a threat? We can't, can we characterize that as a threat? We don't know, because we don't know the overarching intention.
Because
If
threat implies intention in the sort of intelligence world use of that term. It's a technical term, right? And it implies.
Yes, it's a yes. And so as I'm looking at this, based off of what you described, we have a bunch of various, wildly varying encounters, which describes the absurdity of the phenomena. Because in one instance, like when you look at some of these cases that Jacques Vallée talks about, I think it's in Dimensions. The bride in one of them is like disappears for like 200 years, and then in the same location, somebody's given like coal that turns into gems. That's wildly absurd, right? So we have the absurdity. They want to fix global warming. We could deem that as benevolent. Of course, that comes with a lot of key factors for how they want to fix global warming.
Sure. Yeah.
Because mandated population reduction, could fix global warming. But if that's something that an external element wants to impose, that's a threat to the very sovereignty and dignity of you as a person. And then they want to put plants down that eat butterflies, and let's say that now it becomes a value proposition, right? That could be malevolent because it wants to kill butterflies, but does it end up like, I don't know, giving a root vegetable that solves world hunger? Is that at that point, it becomes a value proposition, and then you gave a third statement regarding, wiping out part of Indonesia, right? I mean, so that seems rather malevolent. Would there be a value proposition off of that? I don't really know. I think the orthogonal approach removes sovereignty and it becomes a math problem, right? And the problem with looking at it like that is that now you're just equating based off of, what is gained because of the risk. But looking at it from an as an intelligence professional, you're giving me behavioral characteristics of something that I wouldn't want to interact with.
So when you talk about benevolence, malevolence, or ambivalence, is that an estimation, or is that based on certain ideas we have about intentions, or are intentions irrelevant to whether we estimate it as benevolent or malevolent, and it's really just about what the possible outcomes would be? Like is an entity or an agent that would try to do something good for you, but do it really stupidly in a way that harms you, is that a benevolent or malevolent agent?
It depends on your data set. How stupid have they been in the past, right? You can't have a one-off anecdote. And so, going through this dissertation, that's the issue with trying to analyze and assess intent, right? Is that I'm one dude, one guy, looking at a bunch of data that is essentially pithy 3 to 5 line statements, and then trying to run it through an analytical methodology, like a structured analytic technique, like analysis of competing hypotheses, scenarios and indications, the Delphi method, all these other various tools to try and do this. And as I'm one guy sitting here looking at pithy 3 to 5 line statements, the problem that you have is the lack of data doesn't provide any sort of insight into behavioral characteristics. So does that, so like I can't, I mean,
yeah, totally. Like you can, it's almost impossible to try to divine intentions or anything like that when you're using a technique.
But also, guys, I would throw in there that maybe one species, because they think differently than we do entirely. Their plans are different than ours. But one species, benevolent actions maybe looked as or conceived as malicious intent from us, from a different species. And I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. They're far more advanced than we are and know probably better the outcomes of this than we do. But I always think that too. It's like they don't seem to go out of their way to be rude. It's not like they drop you back off at home in your bed without skin. You know what I mean? Like they do a good job to basically put people back, not to harm them as much as possible. Obviously, it does happen, but I think they're not malicious. They're not evil intents. And the common denominator out of all of this is that they're here for us. Right? At least as far as we understand, they're constantly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just going around the planet doing their thing. We are the reason why they're here. And I think we don't focus on that enough. We're just like, who are they? What do they want? But why us specifically as humans? Why are they interested in us? There's obviously a project, bigger picture than we possibly understand. And I think that's why we look at it like, if the government or the people who know what's going on were to reveal, we would all lose our minds. Maybe, but maybe we're becoming more aware that this is the situation, whether or not we like it, and we have to learn to deal with it or accept it. At least that's my own personal opinion. But Katie, go ahead, ask us a question.
Well, it's kind of a two-part question. As a investigator and researcher myself, and looking at almost 2,400 cases, do you think there needs to be standards and protocols, and how did you vet the initial investigators of the case? Because I found that to be quite difficult, and especially when you're looking at historical cases, you don't know who or how or what process they use to investigate the case in the first place. And how did you find that out, or what were your protocols for that? And then also, what were your disciplines and protocols for keeping your own biases in check?
Those are awesome questions.
Great questions. Yeah. Wow.
I got to take notes. Make sure I answer. I heard 3 in there, so I got to write it down and make sure I get them all.
See what she did there? That's called a left hook. Wasn't expecting it.
Okay,
I think
so let's start. Gonna throw up the block there. Not really. Okay, let's start with the future standards, right? I actually do call for standardizing information reception and putting it into a database repository. That's it actually came up with a reporting mechanism, like reporting templates and a reporting process to make sure that it's if it's adopted as a standard, it would lead to better, more refined reports. And then you as the investigator can go back and be like, yeah, no, you didn't do it the right way. So now we have to either scrap it or go back to step 1. So like that's in my recommendations to practitioners, which is next presentation if we make it to it. If not, it'll be the 3rd iteration of going through that. And then we can talk about that more in depth when we get to there. The investigators protocol. I couldn't do it. There's no way. So to go back and find investigators who looked at it, I had to assume risk and say, this is what's available. I'm using a technique designed to work with inaccurate, incomplete, and deceptive information. And so when I come across, people who have the knowledge and the wisdom to understand the standards of investigations that have been done on certain cases, like yourself, Larry Hancock, to name another, and you peruse a data set, you can be like, yep, take that one out, take that one out, because the process is in place. I don't know it. I know what I have to work with. And that was the overarching goal of it, was to take what we had available, what people were saying, and then use this method to demonstrate that it works. Now you can do it. And then we can work on refining it. And one of the key points that I make in all of these presentations is that go back and check my work. That's what good science does. It's what good investigators do.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the data set. Let me, go through which ones are solid, which ones aren't. We can refine it, redo the analysis, and see what comes out on the back end, right? You can't be married to your findings and conclusions. And frankly, you can't be married to your work when you're an investigator, because stuff changes, right? And that's key. So how did I address the biases? Well, structured analytic techniques is a means of addressing your bias, right? That's design of it is, and you start with key assumptions. And we're going to get to the key assumptions that were developed for the analysis of competing hypotheses. But like, if we want to get to the process of how I addressed it, one of these code books, codebook number 13, are some of the biases that I wrote down. So that way, going into the data set, I could make those mental notes. This is why you hear me say a lot of times, like with the NHI piece, right? It's not a matter of whether or not I believe in non-human intelligence, right? It's a matter of, what does the data demonstrate? What is it pointing to, right? And so even for this conversation that we're having, we're going in with the key assumption that whatever it is has some sort of non-human intelligence element associated with it. That's a bias, and that's important to understand that. Like, it's fine to apply that as long as you acknowledge it and say, yeah, that's a key assumption. We are making the key assumption that NHI is present. Okay, now we can look at the data set as though NHI is present. Now let's go back and look at the data set and say it's not NHI. And that's important when trying to frame out, I mean, as you know, when trying to frame out what it is that you're trying to do with the data you get. When we get to the next session, and I have my part on my key assumptions and on my scenario outcomes for analysis of competing hypotheses, it's going to help to better answer your question about how did I address the biases? Because you'll see them in there. You'll see the key assumptions. You're like, yep, Yep, we can see that it turned into a key assumption. We can see what his scenario outcome is. And so every study that I'm going to do that has to do with data sets with UAP is going to start with my key assumptions. And it's going to start with me taking a catalog of the biases. You can't always mitigate your bias.
Yeah.
It's just not possible. What you can do is acknowledge it and state it, you know, because if somebody who's able to mitigate it or doesn't have the same bias, they can come behind you and, you know, run the data set differently and maybe get a different outcome. Right.
So what you're saying basically really is you need to be really self-reflective, self-aware, and look at the big table and then big picture, and then kind of write those down and go through them like from that. Okay. Thank you for that answer. It's really
Of course.
The
That's why I
opposite of
say you
Twitter.
got to go into this mind
the opposite of Twitter.
open.
There you
Yeah.
go.
Wide open. Yeah, don't do
Well,
what Twitter.
Yeah. Well, we're going to close it here soon, but one of the things that I want to touch on is, and obviously there's some stuff you could talk about, some stuff you can, but we were talking about reverse engineering of these crafts that at least some government officials or people in the world, other countries have these craft reverse engineering. And you were talking about deceptive information as part of the exclusion of what you're talking about. Have you come across any cases that sort of seem like there was some outside influence to muck the case or to make it deceptive? Loaded question, I know.
I mean, that's a hard one, right? In CI, we spend a lot of time understanding the tenets of misinformation and disinformation, right? And even again, right, like that's another key assumption that we're going through this conversation. Some government somewhere has it there, right? That's a key assumption. Whether or not we believe it doesn't matter. That's what the key assumption is, right? I'm not sure our data sets are refined enough to be able to answer that. Right? You know, that's why it's extremely important to have a standardized process for how UAP events are investigated, how they're processed, you know, how they're disseminated, how chain of custody for evidence is handled. Because there's no way I can answer that question. Because like if our data sets are so weak that you know we're analyzing 130,000 reports off of one database and we have no way of determining, you know, if it meets the criteria of UAP, we can't answer that. But that also speaks to a bigger issue. Excuse me, sorry. We don't yet have a criteria of UAP. We don't have a taxonomy or an ontology of unidentified anomalous phenomena. As we'll see in subsequent slides, I have the start of a taxonomy. I have when people say, I saw a triangle, this is what they mean. That's the profile statements spelled out in the dissertation, right? But it's based off of current data sets. Could there be deceptive information in there? Probably. I mean, you know, it's what we have. And that's the most important part when approaching a phenomenological issue like UAP, using this type of data set is that or these types of data sets. The best way to determine disinformation, especially in the UAP realm, is to have refined data sets based off of an industry, and a UAP industry standard of investigation, right? You have to have that where, you know, your standard operating procedures are built that even address issues of what happens if somebody sees an anomalous event in one state and as it goes across other states, some say it's a UFO, others say it's a balloon, right? You know, there should be an analytical support element designed to determine what that was. So that way that also doesn't dilute your data sets, right? So you know, when we're calling for how do we find deceptive information, well, you have very solid, information to rely on. Good way to look at it, right? How do you find counterfeit money? You know the ins and outs of real money. It's the same. It's just, and so that's, so when we talk, like, how would we find that? That's how we would find it, is that, the UAP community would have some sort of an agreed upon industry standard on how to conduct investigations, how to analyze information, and how to process and disseminate it.
And here's the thing. I'm still going to talk about Aero and Sean Kirkpatrick here. In the hour that you've been here, you have put more concise and I can't say the word mythology. The way that you have applied this, sometimes my French Canadian comes back up. You can hear it, especially if I'm drunk, you'll hear the French Canadian. But you put this in a context where we can understand. We've had a bunch of, Congress hearings and, Sean Kirkpatrick and Aero being questioned, and we have never gotten this level of sophistication in identifying the phenomenon and all that, which to me just sort of discredits the government and their so-called funding program, when something like the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, which both you and Michael are part of, are doing far better work in the field, that you guys know that it's going to require all the different fields of study, everything in between. If we're dealing with a civilization, you don't want just a guy that focuses on geology or some guy that just focuses on, back engineering. You want a plethora of different disciplines to figure this out. But you guys are doing such good work at the Scientific Coalition, and these presentations, they need to be shown to more people. And I love that we're able to do that on this podcast, that it is that kind of platform for people to get more educated, especially like this. This is in-depth stuff. And I look forward to your next presentation. Part 2 and part 3 should be quite cool, because you'll have summed it all up for us. Before I leave, or at least close off, I'm just going to ask Katie and Michael if you guys have any final questions for our guest today.
No, I just want to thank him, and I'm looking forward to part 2 and 3 as well. So I look forward to that.
Yeah, I think I have a lot more questions here, but I think I'm going to save them for the end, because I don't want to sort of trip you up or even maybe influence how you go about the rest of the presentation. So I'm looking forward.
And I'm also open that after we get through the next couple of parts, if we want to do a session of just Q&A on it as well, that's perfect.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That'd be a great one. Yeah, that's a good idea. And even get more panels on with people like yourself from the scientific community, different disciplines, and let's just do a panel of different disciplines. We're trying to do one for the journalists right now, the big names in journalism covering UAP. So fingers crossed that comes about. But I'd love to do one with more people from the Scientific Coalition, because what they're doing is exactly what this podcast is all about. And we highly, praise the Scientific Coalition for what they're doing. They're actually putting the work in, and they're actually proving themselves to be far more capable than our governments when it comes down to this. So, round of applause for you guys. Well, thank you so much, Joshua. Just before we leave, is there anywhere that people could find you or reach out to you concerning your work?
Well, I have a Zenodo link. I mean, I don't run I'm on LinkedIn. There we go. Yeah, that's it.
We got to hook you up, boy.
LinkedIn.
Yeah, we got to hook you up.
Wait a minute. Do I have any platform? Yes, the best way to get a hold of me to talk about the topic, is on LinkedIn or through the email address I have specifically set up to talk through UAP related things, and that's uapstudent@proton.me. You can reach out to me there. If not, you can find me on LinkedIn. I got a big grin wearing a vest, says Joshua Pierson, U.S. Army Chief Warrant Officer 4, and then it has my position as National Security Advisor to the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies and the National Security Advisor to the Society for UAP Studies.
You know what I love? When somebody goes through their everything that they've done, their studies and their titles and all that, I just feel like I have not accomplished anything in life. You know what I mean? Like, that's just, they have a list like this, and I'm like, well, I draw, I read. It's crazy. But yeah, thank you so much, Joshua. And we'll do part 2 here coming up.
All right. Hey, appreciate being on. I love coming on and getting to talk with y'all.
I love it, man. Yeah.
But the work you guys are doing, and I'll do this plug before we hop off. The work, I mean, it's needed, it's relevant, and it's extremely important. You create an environment that fosters open discussion.
Yeah.
And that's
We tried to. Yeah.
that's I mean, it's needed. And you know, I've got some other guests in mind that I'd like to you know, start pushing your way to have them on too.
100%. And that's what we're about, educating not only ourselves, but the listeners as well. We're all learning as we go along because we always say there's no experts.
That's right.
Maybe besides Katie, because she's been at this for so long. But there's no, to me, as far as I'm concerned, like I'm not an expert on this. I'm still a student and I still don't know what the hell's going on. You know what I mean?
None of us do. Nobody knows what's going on. We just know it's something.
Yeah, but it's fun to talk about. And I know some people on Twitter said, you know what, these shows, they run out of subjects to talk about because there's only so much. And I'm like, I beg to differ. Are you kidding me? And I love that. And
it's because they're approaching it with a key assumption or a bias, depending on how you look at it.
It's hard to put that aside. I was even biased about Bigfoot, and I told that to Michael and Katie. I anything Bigfoot, I would just dismiss. And now I can't dismiss anymore because it's in the data. So I have to go with it. You know what I mean? Like I can't do anything about it. It's there. So I have to accept it. So awesome. We're going to do part 2, guys, coming up soon, and part 3. And we're going to rock and roll and find out more about his dissertation and what data he did find out. And I'm looking forward to this because this is exactly up our alley, guys. So awesome. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more of UAP Studies podcast.